So in this session, we are going to discuss the Federal Reserve and the last three chairpersons of the Federal Reserve, and if they faced any crisis and how they dealt with it. Then we will have a panel discussion about their policies, whether they were efficient or not, and whether those are policies to be undertaken if there is a crisis in the future. So we will have a brief overview of the Federal Reserve, which is an independent entity. It's the central bank of the United States. It's central, but it's decentralized. There are, as we know, there are 12 districts in the 12 Federal Reserves in the Federal Reserve systems. Each of them work independently, but they are overseen by the Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors is one of the three key entities of the Federal Reserve System, which is then overseen by the Congress. Therefore, it is at the same time independent and works closely with the government, as we know. The Federal Reserve tries to, aims to promote sound and effective economic system, to promote stable economy in the economic system, stabilize employment, high employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. They want to maintain a stable financial structure. They work with banks for the payments and settlements, both in the United States and with outside of the United States. And they aim also to protect consumers with research and analysis, then undertake policies to protect consumers, as we saw in this pandemic, for example. Okay, is it working? So with this brief introduction, we are going to see the current and the last two heads of the Federal Reserve and how they face the economy. So Jerome Powell is the current chairperson of the Federal Reserve System, and he was appointed by President Trump in 2018. When he came on board, we had a healthy economy in the United States, and then suddenly came the pandemic in early 2020. So before the pandemic, the unemployment rate was about 3.8%, and then it started to increase and went to almost 15%. Due to pandemic and the lockdown, consumption was lowered, and which affected the aggregate demand, which created, the entire thing created a recession, which was unlike the previous Great Recession that we had. This was caused by a public health crisis, not economic operations. I'm having some. Okay. So as you can see in this graph, the gross domestic product had a negative growth. It went to, in quarter 2 of 2020, it went to minus 32.9%. This shows how badly the economy was affected. And unemployment rate, as you can see in this graph, the in 2009, after the recession of 2008, was about 10%. Then it was lowered with different policies, and then it went up to almost 15% in April, May of this year. So Powell's approach to this was expanding the lending programs to small and mid-sized businesses, and even for larger businesses, they had some programs. The funds that allocated for this were larger than the stimulus for 2008 during President Obama. This worked with the fiscal support at the same time, and a combination of monetary and fiscal policies to face the crisis. He lowered the interest rate and currently is almost zero, and he plans to keep the interest rate at near zero. Other Fed, the previous chairs of the Fed agree with his approach, and Janet Yellen supports his opinion. Now for the future, from right now he wants to continue, but for the future, as long as we are dealing with COVID, Jerome Powell has asked the Congress to support more stimulus to help the economy, especially help those who have faced, who have suffered from this recession, and keep the interest rate again near zero. And he's also calling for fiscal support. Now let's go to Janet Yellen, who was the previous chairperson. She was appointed by President Obama, and during her tenure, there was no crisis, but she was faced with the consequences of the Great Recession of 2008, where large amounts of money were injected in the economy. So she had to manage this to avoid other problems. So she had to stop the flow of the money to the economy, but at the same time, she considered the human factor, which means for her, it was important how people are affected by the recession, and she wanted to support them. Therefore, she lowered the interest rate also, which, if you look into it, she had good intentions, but then it contributed to more inequality. Her mandate was ended in 2018. She wasn't appointed by President Trump for another term, and left a stable economy for Jerome Powell. Now we'll go over the next one. If I have difficulty with this. Okay. The previous one was Ben Bernanke. He was chairman of the board from 2006 to 2014. And of course, during this time, he faced the Great Recession of 2008, which started in 2006 and went on to even after 2010. His approach was he stimulated the economy with quantitative easing, which means the Fed purchased mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. He wanted to have a more transparent Federal Reserve, so he had quarterly press conference and transparent communication. Even his policies were more transparent than his previous one, his predecessor. So this is a brief overview. So what I wanted the panel to discuss is whether these policies have been efficient to deal with high unemployment, for example, and if the crisis continues or we have another crisis, are these policies to implement? Are they efficient? Should the Fed focus on monetary policies or ask the government for fiscal policies? Or how about the human factor? In fact, in teaching, I had several of my students who were affected by this crisis. They lost their jobs or they got the disease. So how to deal with these economically? These are the things I wanted to bring up, and perhaps we can discuss them. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Milena Boritzer. I am an adjunct lecturer with CUNY School of Business. I've been teaching for over 10 years with SPS CUNY. And my classes are typically ranging from macroeconomics to managerial economics and economics for business decisions. I noticed that some of my students are also in the audience, so welcome to all the participants. And now I will share my screen and we will talk about unemployment. Just a moment. I think Femi needs to disconnect first. Okay, there we go. So we will focus on unemployment amid coronavirus pandemic. And as we know, everything has changed since February, March. All the health environment is changing, the unemployment is rising, and yet there are great opportunities for businesses if we look from the bright side and we find this new niche on the market that are opening for us. With regards to unemployment, we have to focus first on economic growth. One great question that Adam Smith asked a long time ago was why some nations prosper while others lag behind. This is a good question for discussion. And we will discuss this throughout the presentation, and later on we can ask that question to our panelists. Interesting fact is that global income inequality has fallen based on globalization. At the same time, the income distribution within countries has become less equal. With that said, within individual countries, we have huge disparity between the wealthy and the poor. And yet on global level, we have distributed much more equal wealth, which is definitely one of the goals of being united around the world on all levels, especially economic levels. The next part of economic growth will be starting from the early 2000s, the booming financial sector powered growth and job creation in the United States. So we didn't have to worry about unemployment. Businesses were booming, wealth was more abundant. And in 2007, the Great Recession started. This was the time that we had the downturn. And as we always comment, the downturn started again in the United States. It started with the financial and construction sectors and rapidly spread throughout the world. All the Western countries were affected, as well as the smaller and less impactful economic entities. The US gradually recovered to pre-recession levels of output and unemployment, while much of the world failed to do so. So based on this analysis, we can also predict that during the pandemic, although we all fall behind on economic outcome, on growth and financial wealth, we should also expect that with all the resources we have in the United States, we will be able to revive our economy and start fresh very soon with many obstacles. I wanted to share our projection, which is based on the GDP growth. And this will be the GDP growth rate today and tomorrow. So you can see that this is an approximate statistics that shows up until July 2020. Each component is for about 6 months. So we can see that between January and June 2020, we had the GDP growth rate fallen to negative. And between July and December, we expect the GDP growth to be even more so negative. However, the projection for 2021 is 33-31 GDP rate, which gives us an outlook of how the economy behaves. Although it looks very similar to the Great Recession, there are so many factors that contribute at this environment to a much smoother and better transition. Number one that is worth to be mentioned, this will be the stimulus check and the unemployment benefits. These are large amounts that were distributed to the population in need. And because of the pandemic, the money given to individuals did not go to the economy. It stayed in their bank accounts. As we know, socializing is limited. Going to restaurants is absolutely a no for quite a long time. And in certain states, it reoccurs at the moment. Again, lockdowns and restrictions. So although this is not our normal environment and it's not our human interaction to be less social and less connected to our families and friends, it allows the economy to accumulate larger amounts of savings, which helps the banks continue lending and thriving in the near future. Here I want to show the business cycle, and as we know, the business cycle has different stages in which the economy expands and thrives, and we have economic growth. We reach the peak, and as we all know, we are in a recession going downwards. Hopefully the trough is really near, and as the previous slide suggested, in 2021 we should have more optimistic outlook, and we may also anticipate to have growing economy. This is another slide which represents the unemployment rate today. And again, this is a statistics that covers all the way from 2000 until 2020. And we can see how the unemployment rate was fluctuating throughout the last 20 years. And as of today, as of October 2020, we see that the unemployment rate in the United States is projected as 6.9%. The unemployment was quite high at the beginning of the pandemic. And since then, we have been recovering and allowing new businesses to merge or begin their own entities. The next topic aspect that I wanted to focus, it will be measuring unemployment trends. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics, in conjunction with the Bureau of the Census, samples monthly about 50,000 selected households. They usually ask the questions about employment and gather the information to summarize and present what the unemployment rate looks like, in addition to collecting all the statistical data that is available coming directly from business entities. Just as an additional detail, a person that is officially employed is considered a person who works at least 1 hour a week for a pay, or at least 15 hours a week as unpaid worker in a family business. As we all know, unemployment has economic, social, and psychological consequences. Unemployment is not only losing your job, losing your income, it has much more different layers that affect our well-being. We lose our social status, we lose access to specific entities that we had until now, if this will be the fitness membership, if it will be going out more often. Psychological consequences definitely lead to much more depression and isolation in our environment of pandemic. However, there are very strong programs in the community that support all affected from the pandemic, either affected directly or indirectly by the pandemic environment. Changes in unemployment are usually much more interesting to the community. The unemployment rates are read on monthly and quarterly basis, and typically immediately after the unemployment rates are announced, we can see that the stock market reacts, and it's either positive news that will boost the stock market, or it will be a negative news that will bring the stock market in a little bit of a chaotic state. With regards to projections, unemployment rates and earnings by educational attainment, I wanted to bring this slide to your attention as to present how different levels of degree and professional training measures in comparison to unemployment rate and median usual weekly earnings. You can see that the higher education you have, the lower chances of unemployment are for that individual, and the highest weekly earnings are available. And again, these are median usual weekly earnings. They are not applicable and standard. And the next slide shows something similar, but slightly different. It allows to see how students who are earning associate, bachelor's, master, professional degree, or doctoral degree rank among the rest of the employment force, and what are the services that are available for you. How much you advance by gaining your professional degree, and how many opportunities open up in front of our students. It was statistics that was stating bachelor's and higher education allows for 300% higher income in comparison to high school diploma or less individual on the employment market. And with that said, I will hand the next portion to our presenter, Dr. Egbe. He will continue on the topic of globalization. And just one moment. We continue with Dr. Egbe. I think we need to unmute Dr. Egbe.
Yes, I'm sorry. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Chinyere Emmanuel Egbe. I'm a professor at the School of Professional Studies, where I'm an adjunct professor, but I'm also a full-time professor at Medgar Evers College, where I am the chairperson of the Department of Economics and Finance. I've been teaching in CUNY for the last 34 years. Now we have only about 30 minutes left, so we were not able to really make contact with Benjamin. So what I'm proposing to do is to split the remaining time with him. I will take about 10 minutes, and I will then ask him if he has any presentation prepared. If not, then he can raise questions about what we present for the remainder of the session. So I'm just going to take about 10 minutes. Or if I may ask him right now, Benjamin, do you have something to present to us, or would you rather raise questions from what we have?
Thanks, Dr. Egbe, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. Apologies for any confusion regarding the presentation. If I might, maybe just take a couple of minutes. Maybe I could just explain, a little bit about where I'm coming from and how I think about the world. And I think maybe that will be some useful complement to the presentations that Faima and Milena just presented. So I'm an economist and a strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management. My background is as an academic economist, and I studied international trade and international macro, and I've taught some classes in international trade. Clearly not as many as those of you in this part of this panel. But I think, in general, I would say I take a very applied view to the relationship between economics and its use from the perspective of practitioners in financial markets. Part of my job at JP Morgan is to help explain to them, what the connections are between economics and markets. And so, for example, as I look at my screen today, I see the US Treasury yield for the 10-year Treasury bond is about 1%. And so there is a question on our, that comes up with our investment teams, what is normal? What is the normal interest rate with which we judge whether, treasuries are extremely expensive right now or not? And just to put that into perspective, if we went back into the 1990s, the treasury yield circulated at around 6%. And so part of understanding the lay of the land is to recognize that we've had a massive trend in declining interest rates over the past few decades, and trying to explain why that's happened. My contribution is, as we think about, what is our economic outlook and how does that factor into our expectation for interest rates, is to think about the structure relating those two things. Economic theory suggests that, if you're not going into or out of a recession, so if you're in one of these very, elegant, parsimonious, long-run models of the world, then interest rates and growth rates are roughly the same. So if, some of the seminal growth models, like the Solo model of growth, has that result. The long-term risk-free rate is the same thing as the long-term growth rate of the economy. So that's kind of a useful starting point to think about whether 1% treasury yields are reasonable or not. So me asking what is the equilibrium or steady state interest rate is like asking, what is your expectation for long-term nominal growth in the United States? So what is your expectation for real growth, and what is your expectation for inflation? And my I guess what I would suggest is that you can explain a lot of that long-term decline in interest rates with the fact that the drivers of real growth and inflation have been pushing down over time. In other words, part of that difference between 6% in the 1990s and 1% today is coming from the fact that growth is lower and inflation is lower. So just to put that into perspective, over the last 25 years, real growth in the United States has been roughly 2.5% per year, real GDP growth. And if it's helpful to think about that in terms of its underlying drivers and the inputs into production and value added in the United States. So if you think about that 2.5% as being partially driven by labor growth, right? So how many workers do we have in the United States? And the other part being determined by labor productivity growth. So how much output does each one of those workers produce? You can think about that 2.5 as being roughly 2/3 productivity. So about 1.8% productivity and about 0.7% labor growth, right? So that was the backward looking view. That's how we explain previous growth. Going into the future, the situation in terms of demographics is not as robust as it was in the past. And so thinking about the population, which will be growing more slowly in the future, thinking about labor force participation, which is a little bit lower in the future in a world where lots of baby boomers are retired, that's a world in which total growth is lower. So by our calculations, if the only thing that was to change in the world was demographics, you'd be going from 2.5% in the past to 2% in the future. And so as we think about those long-term growth drivers, our overall assessment of growth into the future is about 1.8%, which is assuming that we kind of take on board that demographic change and assuming that productivity is more or less what it was in the past, and in fact just a shade lower than it was on average. The other part of it is inflation. Inflation is much lower in the future than it was in the past. Why is that? Well, you've had these big secular drivers pushing inflation down. Globalization is one source of deflationary pressure. Demographics, you could argue, has been a source of deflationary pressure. Technology, right? We're all on Zoom here, and teaching classes online and doing much more e-commerce than we used to do. Technology is good for growth and bad for inflation, right? So that's another deflationary force that's been pushing inflation down. Monetary policy, as Jaime was saying, as having a harder time pushing growth, pushing inflation back to normal when rates are constrained at the zero lower bound. So there are a host of reasons that inflation has been relatively low today relative to the past, and we see that as continuing into the future. And so, all of that is to say that if you ask for a back of the envelope estimate, what is the 10-year treasury if you're not going into or out of recession? What do fundamentals suggest? Well, we can take our 1.8% real assumption for growth, add 2% for CPI growth over time, assuming the Fed almost hits its target. There's some nuance there, but so just adding 2 plus 1.8 gives you 3.8%. So you're talking somewhere with a 3 in terms of the fundamental drivers of interest rates. And here we are sitting at 1%. And so in a sense, part of our conversation, and I think this circles back to Faime's presentation, is that you know, monetary policy has had to do some extraordinary things to try to stimulate the economy where its normal toolkit is constrained. And what's that? Part of the effect of that has been to push interest rates much lower on average than fundamentals are suggesting. So one of the big questions we deal with in my line of work is, you know, where are interest rates going? And that kind of lies at the heart of the conversation that we've been having today.
Okay, okay, thank you, Benjamin. So I think maybe since you look at global things, let me make my presentation, and then I think I can see what you are saying in the context of what I will talk about. My topic will be on global trade relations post-COVID, the way COVID has impacted global trade relations. Even though primarily I am a statistician and financial analyst, my degree was in economics with an MBA and a PhD in econometrics. I also have quite a bit of background in discussing political economy. And so I'm going to make a presentation. Here I'm sharing my screen. And very simply, the topic that I'm going to be dealing with will be global trade and competition now with COVID. As you know, the COVID just descended on the world very rapidly and very suddenly. Initially, we kind of dismissed COVID and said, okay, well, it's in China. And I didn't blame Trump for his initial dismissal of COVID, but I do blame him for not, you know, taking it seriously when it changed. So, and so, you know, in November, COVID hits China. In February, it arrives in the United States, very few cases, but by March, it spreads like wildfire. And as you can see from the charts here, you can see how quickly COVID has spread, abated, and then spread again, and abated, and then it's really, you know, coming back. These are the rates of change. So you can see the rates of change come down and it goes up again, and now it's kind of like escalating. So you can look at the tables and see the rate of change, like an average rate of increase in the United States and around the world. It's quite frightening. So now the world responds to COVID. And the responses initially were to, you know, there was a lockdown in Wuhan. Then in February, the United States had travel bans, first from China, then from Europe, and then other countries joined in March. And then we had the lockdown. Okay, and what was the impact? The impact of the lockdown around the world, you know, in the United States, you know, unemployment hit because, of course, there was a demand shock and economic output declined. And then there were supply chain disruptions. Also because within the country, there were supply chain disruptions, and even around the world, of course, immediately there were supply chain disruptions. And so what happened, immediately around the world, this immediately wiped out about $50 billion in world trade, according to the International Institute of Strategic Studies in England. And also you had, you know, there was growth in trade also began to decline, and, you know, growth was already anemic. And this is something that I, you know, observed from the statistics. The rate of of growth in world trade was already quite anemic. It was like pretty close to zero. And then with this, all of a sudden, just plunged, and global trade just plunged right away. Now, if you can see, look at the statistics, you can see import trends around the world, just negative everywhere. You can see it graphically below zero. Countries were not able, because of transportation issues and supply chain issues, and of course the demand shock. Then exports, you can see that eventually China was the only country that eventually began to have an increase in exports, in large part because a lot of the medical related products against COVID were actually produced in China. I remember I bought some K95 masks, and I waited for about 3 weeks, and lo and behold, they had markings from China. Oh my God. I also remember that some early vaccines had troubles coming into United States because there were bureaucratic hurdles in China. And so now what this what would be the long-term effects, okay? We don't know yet, but at least we're seeing some signs. Would there be a long-term deglobalization? Would there be declines in multilateral cooperation, for example, through the WTO? There are also national security issues. I mean, if you have something like this, and you have to depend, and the United States, for example, has to depend on China, China could use it as a leverage. There are also global trade uncertainties that will affect FDI flows in countries. And of course, one other thing that would happen is that transaction costs will escalate. All right, so, and there are already signs of it, okay? US has been seeking allies to, relocate production from China. So there have been moves by the United States government. For example, the records indicates that the Japanese government was offering incentives for companies to relocate away from China. The South Korean government began to make offers and give incentives for their companies, for their businesses to relocate production into local manufacturing, and actually has a deal worth about $133 billion to their companies. And then also, I mean, one of the things that we all know about what happened was that air and travel transaction, air travel was, immediately was affected due to the travel bans across the world. And so, and some things just have to be done physically. So, tradable services like tourism, maintenance, passenger transport, these are things that immediately declined in activity as a result of the travel bans, the supply chain disruptions, and again, the statistics from UNCTAD, the United Nations Committee on Trade and Development, air cargo shrank immediately by 24% by March, which very often gave rise to higher unit costs for essential goods. There were increases in the sense, port protocols increased, port closures, more physical examinations, delays that led to higher costs, and also due to these economies. I mean, in the sense that lower volumes lead to higher costs, since if you fly a plane, for example, whether you have 1 ton of goods in it or you have 1,000 tons of goods in it, at least the basic depreciation of the plane is a cost there that you have to factor into what you're doing. And some of these sources of costs, like I said, increased border controls, limited entry points, which lead to delays and overtime for physical labor, Additional sanitary measures would give rise to additional costs. Sometimes, the shortage of drivers would shift, transportation modes. So again, these are factors. Now, I'm going to look at supply chain disruptions and demand shocks, and also uncertainty that, how that would affect, global trade relations, and what would be the implications for, what do you call it, the world order after COVID. And for example, again, I'm talking about signs that you are seeing that would, create problems. For example, in February alone, as soon as these restrictions on international movements began to occur, for example, Toyota sales in China dropped about 70%, right? They're aware. And Fiat, the Italian company, had production, in Serbia that also declined. And then as a result of all of these, companies had lower profits. And so they also, with lower profits, they also had projections to reduce capital investments, which in turn would affect economic growth. So these are issues. And I see also a few examples, statistical examples of the outcome of this COVID shock. For example, FDI flows in 2019 were about $1.5 trillion around the world. And due to measures, again, internal security measures by governments, for example, they had new investment restrictions. They developed policies and incentives to produce goods locally. And so FDI flows around the world declined very sharply, according to estimates from the World Trade Organization, from the United Nations Council on Trade and Development. As you can see some of the statistics, the way it is. So the question now that we need to ask is, what will be the world order after COVID? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Agdi. We actually did have a question come in over the chat. So while you're shutting down your screen, I think let's just go ahead and get to that. The question actually was directed to Benjamin. So Benjamin, the question reads, part of the mission of a business education is to convey the interconnectedness between the various disciplines that are taught. So as an economist at JP Morgan, do you see any specific connections between economics and marketing, perhaps as it relates to consumer behavior?
Sure. There are a number of ways in which you can see the connections between consumer behavior and overall growth. I mean, one of them is simply mechanically that consumption is about 2/3 of GDP, and so if you can help explain the drivers of consumption, you're well on your way to explaining the overall trend in growth. So one of the underlying drivers of long-term growth I was talking about was productivity, and so that's something that's super important, but it's actually very difficult to measure, right? So it's hard to actually say what is the underlying technological frontier. How fast is it expanding, and hence how fast is the economy growing as a result of that? And so one of the applications that is relevant to your question is that we set out to look for evidence of productivity growing, and kind of that we're in a cycle of technological innovation and adoption, and a lot of those have to do with the consumer. So e-commerce is a very important example of technological innovation and adoption that's really been exploding in the US economy. So if you look at the data from the Census Bureau dating back 2 decades, e-commerce was only 1% of retail sales. Fast forward to the eve of the COVID crisis, it was 11%. And then as soon as COVID hit, that kind of amplified that trend, and it went up above 15%. And so it's been growing exponentially. And I think is really indicative of technology that's been changing the way that consumers behave. And so I think that's a very important connection between aspects of marketing and the macro view. So I just I'd say there are ample examples out there. That's just one of them.
Thank you. Dr. Agbe, Professor Musavi, Professor Boritzer, do any of you want to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, in fact, I was curious to ask Benjamin, JP Morgan, or one of whatever company that, if I forgot what you said, I mean, what would be your advice, or how does JP Morgan see the connection between the COVID disruptions and managerial decisions?
So, and you elucidated on several of these, trends in your presentation, but we've definitely seen a few phases of globalization over the past 2 decades. So we saw, since the late 90s and into the early 2000s when China joined the WTO. From there, for the next 10 years, or 10 to 15 years, you saw an explosion in globalization. Both in terms of where consumers get their goods and also where US firms get their intermediate inputs. And so the initial phase, probably went through 2009. Then you had a phase for the subsequent decade where globalization leveled off in several dimensions, which you described. And so I think there's a real sense in which the initial phase of the crisis kind of amplified those a more cloistered economic stance of the United States, and actually probably pushed globalization into regress to some extent. So the trade linkages, as you said, in the depths of the crisis were pretty extreme. So I think our view in the near term is that trade is going to rebound with economic activity. Milena had a great chart which showed you had the biggest single decline in a quarter in GDP growth, followed by the biggest single, positive number in GDP growth in Q3. And so I think, the international trade is going to rebound as overall economic activity rebounds, and maybe the shifts in consumer behavior will contribute to that. To the extent that consumers are spending their money a little bit more on goods than services, in light of the fact that it's difficult to access all the services we used to. That change in the composition of spending is probably favoring trade, in the sense that we disproportionately trade goods versus services. So a bit of a step back initially, but a quick rebound, and who knows, maybe the shift from services to goods might actually lead to a bit of an overshoot in international trade.
Thank you. We did have one more question come in from the audience, and looking at the time, this may have to be our last question for the day. And I think it's directed mostly to you, Ben, but if anyone else wants to weigh in, please feel free. What advice would you give students who want to get into the field of economics? What might be some first steps, or perhaps lateral moves within a company to eventually become an economist?
I bet that everyone's much better qualified than I am to answer that question. I'll just say very briefly, I think I'm a big believer in graduate education in economics. I think there's an option value in getting a master's, getting a PhD in economics, where that can lead you to that rarely closes any doors professionally to things you would like to do afterwards. So from an optionality perspective and keeping your doors open, I'm a big believer in that. I think people. My route to JP Morgan was sort of circuitous through an academic career and then something in policy and to the industry side of things. It probably wouldn't work the other way, right? Starting at JP Morgan, then going into as an academic economist probably wouldn't work. So I'd highly encourage you to do that. The other very practical thing is that these advanced econ degrees are very math heavy these days. And so definitely keep taking those math courses is kind of an intermediate step to reaching that goal.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, Ben said everything, but math is very important. And when they come to classes, they are intimidated by math and these graphs. And so we as instructors, as professors, can help them understand those, understand the math and their applications in economics. And then once they understand, they become more interested. They see that they can apply things, they can solve problems. And as Ben said, to continue their educations to masters and PhD. And that's the road to success, I think, in the economics field.
Great. Well, I think we're just coming up on 3 o'clock. So I think that's actually the perfect way to end the session. So I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists today, as well as all of our audience members. We really appreciate you spending the time with us today. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation and that you got a good taste of some of the other conference sessions as well. And we look forward to having you back next year when we do this again. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.